Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Leading with Ethics and Integrity, hosted by Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development. I'm Mujahid Thebus. I'm the Proposal and Design Specialist for the Africa Channel here at Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development. In today's fast-paced, changing business world, ethical leadership is more than just important. It's a key differentiator. We're excited to have Professor Daniel Malan with us today. He's a renowned expert in business ethics and corporate governance. He will be guiding us through the critical importance of ethical leadership, sharing valuable insights from his extensive experience, which includes being associate professor at Stellenbosch Business School and also founding IntegrityIQ and directing the corporate governance lab at Trinity Business School. We encourage you to engage actively during the session by sharing your questions and comments in the chat. And we'll have a Q&A session following Professor Malan's presentation. So please don't hesitate to participate during these sessions. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'll be handing over to Professor Malan.
Thank you very much, Mujahid, and good afternoon to everybody from a partially cloudy, somewhat cool Dublin, which is somewhat more akin to summer weather that we have in Dublin usually. But it's great to join you, and I really look forward to the next hour or so that we have together. I'm going to share my screen. That seems to be better. So once again, delighted to join you for this webinar. I'd like to give you a brief outline of our session. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have enough time for Q&A and discussion. In terms of the topic, I think it's important that we just get a little bit of conceptual clarity at the beginning about these broad terms of leadership, ethics, and integrity. I want to say a few words about different levels at which we talk about ethics. And then I'm going to focus quite a bit on the role of the integrity officer as the key person involved in leadership on the ethics and integrity front in organizations. I'd like to say a few words about AI and ethics. It was mentioned in the introduction that I'm involved in a startup company at the moment at Trinity College Dublin, and then I'll conclude with a few practical recommendations. I also would like this session to be interactive, so those of you who are familiar with Mentimeter will know what to do. Those of you who are not familiar, if you can take your handheld device like a phone or a tablet and either scan the QR code that you see on the screen now, or at any time just go to the website menti.com and enter that code 82017623. You should be able to see the slides on your device as well, and then respond to 2 or 3 questions that I have as we go through the presentation. Whenever there's a need to respond, you'll also see the website and the code appear at the top of your screen. So if I do go on to the next slide, don't worry, you can still see it at the top of the screen. I'm going to pause. I can see people joining the Menti page, so let's just wait for a couple of seconds until most people have joined, and then I will move on to the next slide, which will be a bit of a repeat of Kerry's introduction, because I would like to ask you in which town or city are you at this very moment. But at least now we'll see all the results on one page. So let's see. We can see Cape Town, Joburg, Durban coming up, and I am conscious of time, so this is really just a test of the technology. I'm going to start a 30-second timer, and at the end of that, we'll see who wins in terms of popularity. I'm trying to figure out how many of these places I've been to. I think more than half of them. Again, wonderful to see the diversity. Welcome to each and every one of you, and great to be joining you from Dublin today. Okay, so let's get into the core concepts. I think it is important to talk briefly about leadership. This is not a webinar specifically on the academic concept of leadership. but I have one definition there that I think sort of captures the essence of what we mean when we talk about leadership, as this ability to influence, motivate, and enable others to contribute to the effectiveness and success of the organization. And immediately I'm going to try and bring this into the conversation about ethics and integrity and leadership. So typically when we talk about ethical leadership, we would then refer to leadership at the board level, from a governance perspective, from the board of directors. Everybody will be familiar with the term tone at the top, leading from the top. We will focus on the position of the Chief Integrity Officer. There are other names associated with that position, but essentially the C-suite executive who's responsible for leading and managing integrity inside the organization. And then, of course, as we'll also see in the next slide, when we talk about leadership, everybody can be a leader. Everybody can display individual leadership in any situation. Ethics, big topic. Philosophical discipline, it's essentially about what's good or bad, or what's right and wrong. And then in the business ethics world, we talk about applied ethics. So similar to medical ethics or media ethics, we have business ethics or organizational ethics, where we ask questions about the application of ethics, ethical theory, ethical decision-making in a business environment. And then the other word that is often used is integrity, coming from the Latin word of integer, which means sort of wholeness. It talks about consistency. Sometimes people would use the term practice what you preach to demonstrate integrity. But interesting also, another development from the root is integration. And I'll talk about that as well, because I think in the world in which we're living, the integration, breaking down of silos, etc., also really important in an organizational environment. Now, 4 levels of business ethics. There are different models. I quite like this one that focuses on the 4 different ones. At each level, you ask a different question. You can see at the systemic level that there's going to be no answer. What is the most ethical economic system? Because it simply would, refer us back to ideology, political positions, and it will depend which position you have, whether you say this one is better than that one. We also see discussions about ESG, environmental, social, and governance, really taking place at the systemic level, having an impact on the global economy, on the planet as a whole at the moment. Industry ethics, yes, we know there are the usual suspects: tobacco, alcohol, gambling, etc., where there is, let's put it mildly, an ethical concern about the product or the service. It doesn't mean that all these industries that I've listed are unethical, but I'm just suggesting that they all have ethical constraints. And we see sort of lately quite a bit of discussions about, generally sort of more uncontroversial industries like financial services also featuring in discussions about industry ethics. The corporate level is where we talk about companies. How does my company behave? And the terms corporate governance, corporate responsibility, you see the word corporate feature there. It's because we are assessing and talking about the behavior of companies, where we say company A is more ethical than company B, or the other way around. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, we can also address ethics at the individual level. For each one of us, we can ask the question, how do I behave? What did I do at home, at work today? And I can work in a company with a very good ethical reputation, in a very clean industry, but as an individual, I can engage in unethical behavior. So let's look at sort of a couple of the contexts and risks and challenges that are involved in this area. And I'd like you to imagine, just for the moment, that you are sort of the chief integrity officer of a large multinational corporation. Revenues in the billions, 100,000 plus employees, operating in 50 countries or more. And each day, in each jurisdiction, as the integrity officer, that each employee in your company has multiple opportunities to engage in unethical behavior. This involves a wide range. We have criminal behavior like insider trading, money laundering, procurement fraud, bribery. There's internal misconduct like cheating on a timesheet or an expense claim, to issues around discrimination, harassment, and bullying. Wide range, not always illegal. Unethical behavior is sometimes illegal, but not always. We talk about lawful but awful behavior sometimes that bother us inside the organization. The repercussions, though, remain significant, and companies can lose their reputation very quickly. They can pay huge fines. Sometimes they cease to exist, and individual employees lose their jobs and sometimes go to jail. There are too many case studies to mention here. The most recent one in the UK has been the British Post Office or Horizon scandal. Some of you might be familiar with that. Thousands of innocent sub-postmasters being pursued for shortfalls caused by faults in a software system that was developed by Fujitsu and covered up over many years. Another example from financial services, 2022, 16 Wall Street firms, including Barclays, Bank of America, Citigroup, Credit Suisse, and a few others, fined 1.8 billion after staff discussed deals and trades on their personal devices and apps. Volkswagen, Dieselgate, familiar with that one, paid out more than $30 billion worldwide as a result of that cheat device that they created. South Africa, we know what happened to Steinhoff before there was Fidentia, and so the list goes on. And that's only at the company level. Now multiply that by 80,000 estimate multinational corporations in the world of the United Nations. 2000, the top 2000 had combined revenues of more than 50 trillion a couple of years ago. And then we go into medium enterprise, small medium enterprises accounting for more than 90% of all businesses. So can we put one number to this? The UN and the IFC and others have tried, and the rough ballpark figure rule of thumb that we're talking about is that each year the world loses 5% of global GDP because of unethical behavior and corruption. Now, fortunately, if you are the integrity officer, of course, you have to worry about 5% of GDP, but you have to think about your own company first. And the chief integrity officer or the ethics and compliance officer or the ethics officer has an uphill task. There are many challenges that they face in this position. I'm highlighting a few on this slide. Firstly, there's no natural qualification that you can have. It's not like becoming an accountant or an engineer where you end up with an academic qualification. So very often people have to learn on the fly. This is also cross-functional. When we think about ethics and integrity in organizations, there's a bit of HR, there's a bit of risk, there's a bit of legal. So it's very difficult for one person to be familiar and an expert in all those positions. Then we are also seeing what I call scope creep, and we see that even in some designations lately where ESG, EDI, corporate social responsibility, some of those more traditional functions that were sitting elsewhere are being integrated and incorporated into this position of Chief Integrity Officer. Working with a company in Canada at the moment, they've actually changed the name to Chief Ethics and ESG Officer to indicate this sort of overlap and the integration that takes place. Add to this complexity, new technology, specifically AI. I'm going to talk more about that, but that adds a new layer of complexity to the world of the integrity officer. And very often, integrity officers struggle because they don't have accurate data. They look longingly at their colleagues in the sustainability reporting departments who have access to very expensive and sophisticated software, but often integrity officers still rely on sending out emails, sending out spreadsheets, trying to get some data that they can use to analyze and to report to an exco or a board of directors. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, as an integrity officer, you don't have a very receptive audience if you look around you, because the work that you do, the things that you're trying to uncover, and the word suggests it already, is people trying to hide the things that they do if they get engaged in misconduct. So it's very difficult to get through to them. It's very difficult to convince them to change their behavior. And this increases the difficulty of the role of the integrity officer. Or sometimes they don't try to hide it, but they're simply ignorant. They don't know what they're supposed to do or not supposed to do. So not trying to be too negative, there are solutions to this, but that is the situation in many organizations. My question to you, just to get a sense of this audience, is if you look back over the last 12 months, how would you say the integrity in your organization has changed? Has it stayed more or less the same, or has it improved slightly, substantially, or decreased slightly or dramatically? And like before, I'm going to start a timer for 30 seconds only to give you the opportunity to respond to this question. Ten seconds left. Right, so we almost had a normal distribution here. I suppose that's good to see that at least for the majority of you, there hasn't been regression. And then overall, slightly good, more positive picture as well, with slight or even some substantial improvement. But we also see some of you struggling with decreases, some dramatic decreases in the integrity of the organization. How do you respond to this? I'm relying here a little bit on work that I did a couple of years ago with the World Economic Forum, where we did some research on this developing role of the Chief Integrity Officer. It resulted in a publication also linking business integrity with strategy and a strategic response to ethical challenges. But you can see on the left-hand side an agenda that we developed within the forum to identify 4 key pillars of leadership action by companies. I'll run through them fairly quickly. Number 1 is this idea that we have to move beyond compliance, and I'll come back to that in my conclusion as well. Compliance is necessary, but not sufficient. Secondly, culture is incredibly important. If we simply think about compliance, then we don't really change behavior. We don't manage to change the culture and incentivize people to do the right thing. Number 3, again, mentioned already, there's new technology. The jury is out whether it's an unalloyed good, but at least there are new technologies available that we can use. And finally, the idea of collective action. We looked at the global scale of the problem. Yes, as an integrity officer, you can talk about what's wrong and you can try and change what's wrong inside your organization. But if we don't look at collective action, industry partners coming together, public-private partnerships, then the scale of the global problem, looking at the systemic level, simply too large to resolve. And this is, for me, really the nuts and bolts of it. This is a framework that I developed to guide and to talk about sort of the basic components of an integrity management program. Just because the world out there is complex and we have new layers of complexity coming in, doesn't mean that we can't have a sort of a fairly straightforward, simplified model that can address all the different components of what an integrity officer should do to lead effectively. And I've identified these for assessment, behavior, compliance, and disclosure. Starting with assessment, that's always the baseline. If you don't have the data, you wouldn't be able to know what to change. So you have to understand the ethical culture and the ethical risks inside your organization. Usually that would be linked to a confidential employee survey of some sort, perhaps focus groups, perhaps interviews. But as a baseline, you need that understanding of both the culture and the risks of your organization. Behavior talks about the behavioral change. As I mentioned a moment ago, if we simply look at compliance, then you're not really going to change behavior. So we really have to change the culture of the organization to change the behavior. That has implications for ethics programs, and it means moving away from tick box compliance exercises to empowering people to understand complex ethical issues. There's a report that was published by the Institute for Business Ethics yesterday that highlights this again, a substantial percentage of respondents indicating that the ethical questions that they deal with now are more complex than they were last year or the year before. Compliance remains the minimum requirement, so you can never get beyond, well, you can never get around it. You should go beyond it. And then finally, we live in a world where there's increased demands on transparency and the need for disclosure. In the ESG space, in the sustainability reporting space, we know that disclosure requirements are increasing. In the European environment where I'm working at the moment, we now have the European Sustainability Reporting Standards with a specific draft standard on business conduct, and increasingly companies will have to report. It'll be a mandatory requirement for them to report on these activities. A few words about frontier technology, sort of a collective term to talk about AI, blockchain, and big data. And again, just a quick question for you to reply to. How would you respond to this question? I believe the impact of technology, and we talk here about frontier technology, will be from very positive to very negative. 30 seconds to respond. That's good to see the sense of optimism in the room. So the vast majority of you believing that it should be very positive and somewhat positive. I share that optimism. I think that this is something that we can use. And by way of summary, in some of the discussions that I'm involved in at the moment, this is one way of looking at it. The two dimensions. The one is tech for integrity on the right-hand side. That's what you responded to as well. You can use AI in a training environment. I'll share the brief example in a moment of the company that I'm involved in. You can use blockchain to make your whistleblowing facility more effective and more protected. You can use AI to go through huge amounts of data to look for trends, etc. So all of that really helps you to advance integrity in your organization. But at the same time, from an ethical perspective, there are some real concerns and questions about the integrity of tech. What are the ethical issues that we should address when we look at the development and deployment of these technologies? The issues that come up most often would be around trust. It would be around bias being built into these technologies. Autonomy is often used as a concern. Am I really in control when these algorithms decide what I can see and should suggest ways in which I should respond? And then also just at the very basic level of job losses, when technology starts to take over more efficiently even the work that employees can do with real, there's a real concern that people will lose their jobs. And unfortunately, that is the case where there isn't enough innovation to redeploy them or to reskill them. So within this space at Trinity College, I've been involved in this project that's been funded by the Irish government to develop an AI-driven integrity platform. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into this. 2 slides, a learner platform where some of these assessment and behavioral issues that I referred to before sort of are gamified and also personalized through recommendation engines, where each employee in the organization would get an independently or a personalized ethics training program. And at the same time, looking at the problem of data, each integrity officer or the team of ethics officers inside big corporations will get access to a heat map or a dashboard where they get real-time information about risks, about strengths, and analyzing the ethical culture inside the organization. So to wrap up, I have 1 or 2 minutes. I know this has been a whistle-stop tour about sort of a very big topic. But these would be sort of my recommendations for anybody who is in a position of leadership and with some responsibilities for ethics and integrity inside their organizations. Firstly, compliance remains important. So have the basic building blocks of compliance in place. It's part of the solution, but not the solution. That's why we talk about beyond compliance, but we can never discard the importance of a very simple and effective compliance system in each organization. Number two, we deal with integrity. We deal with integration. The idea is, and we see that already happening in big multinational corporations, that silos are broken down to some extent between sustainability, between EDI, ESG, integrity, compliance, etc. So we need to integrate, but that means that we also have to be more comfortable with blurred lines. It is not the situation anymore where you can simply put things in a neat spreadsheet and say yes, no, right, wrong. There's complexity. We need to be comfortable with it, embrace it if possible, but certainly be comfortable with it. Number three, use technology. Technology is a sort of an equalizer. It enables many organizations to leapfrog others that have been sort of investing and developing for many years. Because it changes, and it changes so quickly. I was at a presentation last week where a technology expert said, and it really sort of, for me, was a novel way of looking at it, where he said, remember that today AI is the worst that it will ever be. Even though we're very impressed with it, we see there's some concerns. Tomorrow it'll be better, the day after it will be better. So just remember, it's a fast-moving target. Use it, but use it responsibly. Number four, part of this integration, learning and comparing with other functional areas like sustainability or ESG, demand data. If you don't have the data, you cannot track trends, you cannot track progress, you cannot identify weaknesses, and there are different ways in which everybody should be able to collect that data and start learning from the insights that they can get by manipulating that data. And finally, and again, repeating what I said before, if you want to be successful, if you want to be an effective leader, then we have to move beyond tick box compliance and focus on that real behavior change. Changing the culture inside your organization so that people actually behave differently in a complex environment. You empower them to understand the complexities, but also the fundamental values in terms of what is right or what is wrong, what is acceptable in a company, in an industry, guided by codes and regulatory frameworks. Help them to do that, and slowly but surely we can start sort of chipping away at that 5% of global GDP. It's not going to happen overnight. Yes, there will be companies that are more advanced than others. Not everybody will be successful, but ultimately it's an individual challenge. As it broadens out and companies start to engage in collective action, hopefully we will see the dial shift. And on this Global Ethics Day, let's sort of look into the future with a positive eye and see whether we can also commit and work towards building that better, more ethical world. Thank you very much. I will hand back to the facilitator. I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Professor Daniel. We do have some questions.
I've kicked off with a question in the chat, Prof.
Oh.
Right, I'm just opening the chat now. Let's just see. I'm just scrolling up or down. So Jane, your question is, how can businesses around the world balance the pressures of rapid growth with the need to maintain high ethical standards, especially in markets where political instability, corruption, etc., is a significant risk? Yeah, it's a great question. It's a challenging one because if we understand rapid growth as one that does not include a commitment to ethical standards or sustainability, but simply moves back to that sort of dog eats dog world of shareholder primacy and doesn't matter what we do as long as we don't get into legal problems, then it's going to be very difficult to maintain the ethical standards. So rapid growth within, and it sounds like a bit of a contradiction, but having rapid growth while thinking of the long-term impact of your activities, and balancing that also in terms of the regulatory environment that is getting sort of increasingly stringent, simply to try and mitigate against the harm done by those who are simply interested in rapid growth regardless, but also building your activities on a sort of a foundation of ethical standards should be able to demonstrate sort of that sustained growth, but not necessarily rapid growth. In some cases, we can have rapid growth, and in the technology space, obviously, if you scale quickly, it doesn't have to be a negative. So you can employ technology. I know there are environmental concerns also in terms of data centers and the impact. We're getting some guidance locally here, even about the environmental impact of a signature at the end of an email when you start multiplying that by thousands or millions. But you have to analyze that growth, whether it's rapid or slow, whether it is in sync with the principles of sustainability, and assess that on a case-by-case basis. I see there's a question. Yep.
Sorry, Prof. Melissa has a question, and it also links to one further down. How does an ethics officer win changing the organization's behavior? Which also links to a question further down saying, what are some ways to achieve behavioral change in employees?
Right. So I think the first part of that question is you need to win that battle internally if you experience resistance, by convincing people about the value that you can add to the organization. So if we go back to those sort of fairly horrific sort of fines and consequences that I discussed at the beginning of my talk, if you can convince your CEO or your board of directors that the position that you are in has been created and really exists to mitigate against those risks and to help turn the organization around in terms of ethical culture and behavior, then there's the so-called, it's overused, but the business case for business ethics inside the organization. If you have, and again, data as well, to prove that there's been a decline in unethical behavior. There's a lot of research, even in the so-called softer areas, about just treating people with respect, respecting their dignity, and see how that has an impact on their loyalty and therefore productivity, and ultimately on the bottom line. If people don't steal from the company, if they don't cheat, if they don't accept sort of bribes or get involved in conflicts of interest where they serve their own purposes rather than that of the company, then the company benefits every time. So that's the case that the integrity officer has to make to the organization. For big multinationals, I mean, it is a protected position, so people will be appointed in that position, but sometimes they will deal with internal suspicion, and they would need to to engage with their colleagues and stakeholders to convince them of that role. And there is empirical data, there's sort of moving trends. You can look at what best practice is, what leading companies are doing around the world, and use that to show to your board or CEO and say, this is what they do, this is how they benefit, we should do the same. How you change behavior then, I mean, that becomes part of that rollout, becomes part of the integration, and that is designing the right training tools, designing kind of the right interventions, leaning on behavioral ethics to some extent. I'm not sort of a complete and uncritical supporter of the developing field of behavioral ethics, but essentially moving away from giving tick box training to empowering people to think for themselves and to make decisions. We often say that if you do compliance training only and you keep threatening people that you're going to get into trouble if you misbehave, then their knee-jerk reaction is to look for loopholes, or they come back to you with a code and they would say, show me in the code where it says I cannot do this. Now, if you have a culture like that in the organization, it's not going to be very constructive. if you rather sort of empower people to say, do you understand how also for you it will be beneficial to work in a company with a great culture, with a good reputation, that is more profitable because it's ethical, then you will have sort of loyal supporters of the idea of an ethical organization, and that will translate into change behavior.
Thank you, Prof. I've got another one from Isaac here. Should the role of an ethics officer become a requirement, so mandatory, or should company boards make that determination on a voluntary basis? And if it does become mandatory, how would or should governance requirements evolve to get to a point where the ethics officer is a formal appointment?
Mm-hmm. So thanks very much for the question. I don't think that the appointment of an ethics officer or integrity officer should be or will be a legal requirement. Again, going down the legal route, we immediately run into the compliance problems. So if I have to appoint an integrity officer simply because the law requires me to do that, and I'm not really committed as a company or as a CEO, as a board to do that, we'll try and take shortcuts and appoint somebody, at a cheap rate, somebody that will not rock the boat. But if we're really committed and we understand the value that that person will give, then we will try and source the right person. Good integrity officers globally are sought after resources, so they also come at a price quite often, but that is a price that many companies are willing to invest in because they can see the returns. And we also see that trend in global companies that the seniority of that person has been elevated over time. I have worked in the past with Novartis, the pharmaceutical company. Klaus Moosmeyer, the ethics, compliance and risk officer, is a member of the executive committee of the company. So he sits in right at the top. And I don't know what his salary is, but I think it gives us an indication, that if you employ people at that level and you make them, we say the seat, give them the seat at the table where decisions are made, where strategy is discussed, then it becomes sort of a material issue to the company, and then we'll see the returns.
Thank you, Prof. Sorry, and I've had another question from Kennedy. As a new employee entering a very unethical organization, how do you maneuver or how do you influence the situation in order to turn it around? Can you?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Kennedy, and it comes back to the mention I made earlier about individual behavior. So as a new employee, especially if you are, certainly it would depend on whether you enter as a new employee at a senior level or as a junior employee. And depending on that position, obviously power comes into this. The more senior you are in the organization, or perhaps if you are a new employee, but in that dedicated position of integrity officer, it will be easier. But at the same time, individuals can make a difference at any level inside the organization. And this is by sort of doing different things. One, simply to make sure that your own behavior is beyond reproach at all times. But secondly, also to engage in discussions around ethics. There's a whole literature around this, and Mary Gentili, who developed the curriculum and wrote a book also called Giving Voice to Value, has done tremendous work in this space, where she provides guidelines on employees on how to find their voice. And by that, she means that, you don't have to it's not always a case of I need to be a whistleblower, or it's not always a case of I need to report this to the integrity officer, but you can challenge unethical behavior in different ways, and you can also train yourself to do that. And there are fantastic case studies also in the book about how people developed from that, starting off as a junior employee, being very, very concerned, the first time somebody spoke out that she would be victimized inside the organization. But then when she raised something, a colleague actually said, "Oh, I'm so proud of you that you raised this. I felt the same way." And that empowered her the next time to do something else. So we can all develop our own decision-making skills. We can train on how to respond to things. And in that way, we can help to turn it around collectively.
Thank you, Prof. And then another one here from Nashina is, how should an ethics officer handle a situation where the board is acting unethically and in fact the entire management team has been silenced by bullying and the threat of suspension, dismissal, etc.? Linked to this, what is the ethics officer's responsibility in this regard? Thank you.
That's a tough one. Again, if the board is acting not only unethically but also illegally, there would be a responsibility on the ethics officer, I would say, to blow the whistle or to raise external concerns about this. If it's more about the culture of acting unethically and you really are the Lone Ranger fighting against, an overweight of people who do not share your values, I think we have to be realistic. Sometimes you will not be able to change that and turn it around. And we have seen, people try and give up and move elsewhere. Unfortunately, in many parts of the world, not only at the leadership position, but sometimes people also say, well, if your values clash with those of the company, you're uncomfortable with them, resign, go somewhere else. But we know from experience that in many situations, in many countries, that's simply not an option because people need a salary, they need a job to feed families. And those are very, very difficult dilemmas to deal with. So in response, to that question, if you've been silenced and bullied, the best advice I would be able to give is, try and push, try and change it. Perhaps schedule one-on-one meetings with individuals to try and turn them around, because sometimes if the whole mob comes down on you at the same time, it's more difficult. Certainly, if there's something that is not compliant with rules or regulations, there would be a responsibility to speak up about that. But the reality is that in some cases, you might be in a situation where you say, well, I'm not going to be able to change this. And then you'd need to make tough decisions as an individual.
Thank you. And then we have another one from Reinhardt. What is the motivation to funnel the integrity guidance through a dedicated position of ethics officer, for example, instead of addressing this through providing leadership direction generally?
Reinhardt, great to see your name again. We were in the MBA group many, many years ago at Stellenbosch. I would give a couple of different comments on this. The first one is that I'm a little bit cynical sometimes about companies who say we don't need a dedicated position. Everybody is ethical. Our CEO is the chief ethics officer. It's in our DNA. We don't need any structure around this. It might be true in extreme cases, but 9 times out of 10, I think that is sort of wordsmithing, blue washing, whatever you want to call it, for people just to say, well, we're going to try and talk our way out of this. So there is a need for a dedicated position simply because it gives the indication and it sends the message that you take this seriously. Yes, you are funneling it, but if you give the resources to that person, they would also then have the resources again to funnel it out the other way and to draw on resources from HR, from risk, from legal. And we see that in many companies also that they have an ethics committee chaired by the integrity officer, but they have those functional areas represented to bring in the specific expertise. So I think you need leadership in one position or in one sort of central area. I think you need to draw on sort of the varied functional areas and expertise in the organization. And I'm cynical about simply saying that it's so embedded in the organization that it's everywhere, even if we can't see it, because that's not always true.
And I actually missed a question from Rudolph, so I'm just going to go back to that one. Rudolph asks why having a legal qualification or background is still a requirement for the function of an ethical or compliance officer.
Rudolph, it's not, as far as I know, because there's a distinction between a legal counsel and an ethics officer. And many companies actually insist on having both those positions because there would be different requirements to those positions. And of course, if you're a legal counsel, then you need a legal background. In my experience, most company secretaries that I've dealt with also have legal backgrounds, but not all of them. But I have seen many ethics and compliance officers who come from different functional areas, HR, risk, internal audits. It doesn't matter. The requirements usually would be, that you are passionate about the position, that you have, the correct qualifications, which is difficult, as I mentioned before, because there isn't, you can't do an MSc in ethics officer responsibilities, but there are many institutes around the world, exec ed courses, etc., that can help people to develop those functions, those capabilities. Sorry.
Prof, I've actually got a question here from Kerry. So in your experience, what are the most effective strategies for leaders to foster a culture of integrity within organizations that are operating across multiple regions with the various and varying regulatory environments? How does one navigate that?
Great question, and that's one that most multinational organizations struggle with, and it comes back to this sort of to use a little bit of academic jargon, but the relativism versus absolutism debate. So if we operate in 50 countries, do we say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do? Then you're quickly going to get into trouble, because then you fall into relativism. At the same time, if you say one rule, there's only one way of doing it, and that's the head office way, and you don't respect local customs and local traditions, then you're going to kill the culture in the organization in those areas. So you need to find that sweet spot between the two. And what I advise companies to do, and again, this is based on some academic theory. Tom Donaldson from the Wharton School, wrote many years ago about something he calls hypernorms on the one side and moral free space on the other. But essentially what it says is that you need to have some non-negotiable values and principles in an organization, but then allow your local jurisdictions to have some flexibility around it. Give one very simple example is many multinational corporations have a principle of non-discrimination as a sort of a fundamental principle of the company, yet when they operate in countries like South Africa, where there's a need for affirmative action or for addressing the wrongs of the past, then both from an ethical and from a legal perspective, you will deal with it differently than in another country. So that is the challenge, and the integrity officer plays a huge role in that. Company that I'm working with at the moment has what they call ethics ambassadors. So they have different ethics ambassadors in different countries around the world, and those people are very, very familiar with the local context, but they're also familiar with the global context, and they act as a sort of a go-between, if you like, between the need for global consistency and the need for local relevance.
Thank you, Prof. I've actually got a couple of questions that are coming through to me on direct message. So if you don't mind, I'd really love to read this one out. I'd really like to talk about AI and digital a bit more. So selfishly, I'm going to be asking this question. So how can leaders leverage digital tools like AI-driven platforms, etc., to promote ethical governance while ensuring that these technologies are used responsibly and, of course, without bias? And I am just conscious that we've got 8 minutes, but I have a
Yeah.
couple more questions that I'd like to also get answered. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I would make a few comments on that. Number one, I think it's important to understand the technology at a high level. And that's the first challenge that senior executives and boards should overcome. We recently had a sort of a 2-day course for board directors just to make them familiar with some of the technology, to understand it, that they can talk with some confidence without going into the technical details. So be familiar at a high level with the technology itself. Number two, be familiar with the ethical concerns. So, if words like trust or bias or autonomy are used, then at that level, you should be able to, and a great test is simply to say, would I be able to explain this to my friend in 30 seconds, that this is a problem? Number three, be brave. We've seen a few boards around the world that have now incorporated AI chatbots as directors, mostly non-voting directors on their boards, where they invite AI to listen in, to make recommendations, to summarize. It is scary to some extent, but there are new ways as well to protect that information. It's not going to go into ChatGPT's sort of general domain where other people can access that, and also review on an ongoing basis. As I said a little while ago, from the time I mentioned it until now, there might have been sort of new developments in the space. So you have to keep up to date. Build in have somebody on the board, perhaps recruit new people with those skills, or allocate that responsibility to an existing director. Obviously, companies have chief technology officers and others that would be more keen to this. But again, as I mentioned before, the challenge there might be that if you simply have a techie that doesn't understand the ethical concerns, then you get into translation problems again. And that brings me back to the need for integration.
Thank you. I have, hopefully we've got time for 2 more, but let's go for the first one. So given the prevalence of informal markets and traditional economies in regions across the continent, what ethical considerations should business leaders keep in mind when formalizing business practices?
That's a difficult one. Just read the question again, please.
So given the prevalence of informal markets in many regions in Africa, what ethical considerations should leaders keep in mind when formalizing their business practices, if any, on an SMME scale?
Yeah. So it's a tough one. I think there are different angles that one can take on this question. The first one, just to say that is, of course, also the problem with many of these sort of technologies, is that it is a double-edged sword. So you can use something like blockchain, for example, to really ensure protection of data and privacy. But at the same time, if you employ it to hide money laundering, in an informal market, then it becomes very difficult to regulate and to find those examples of unethical or illegal behavior. So that's one way of looking at it, as sort of both a threat and an opportunity. The other one I would say is that within, if we talk about informal markets, more perhaps in the sense of having newcomers to the market or less formalized businesses that are coming into the market, technology is an equalizer like nothing we've seen before. I mean, you can, and again, there might be some ethical concerns about transparency, but you can probably pretend to be a multinational organization, just with a cell phone and a few sort of accounts to a few different software programs. You can scale incredibly quickly with technology, and again, that has opportunities and risks attached to it. So I would always encourage people, to think about their own particular context. This is not something that is the domain only of the big multinational organizations. Everybody can use it. but that also means that everybody must have some level of comfort with the power, but also the risks associated with the technology.
Thank you, Prof. I do have a couple more questions, but I'm very conscious of everyone's time, and I know we like to finish promptly on time. So I'm going to leave it there. If you could just do a final word, a minute or two of a bit of a summary for us, and then we'll hand back over to Mujahid to just do some final thanks for everyone.
Thanks very much. It was delightful to be part of this, and thanks again for the invitation. I think this is a very exciting field. I would perhaps sort of summarize by saying that it is possible to simplify in a complex world. So we often get overwhelmed by all these complexities, even in medium-sized organizations, and say we'll never be able to deal with this because it's too complex, it moves too quickly. But once you break it down into constituent parts and you have a little bit of conceptual clarity about what you achieve, it becomes a lot easier, not less challenging, perhaps to design programs that would be fit for purpose for your own organization. So I would advise or suggest to anyone who's interested in pursuing this in their own organizations to start by having a very good look at their own environment, at their own context, and use that as a point of departure rather than just taking things or frameworks that seem to be attractive and trying to sort of import it uncritically into their own environments.
Thank you for that, Professor Daniel. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar on leading with ethics and integrity. Also, a special thanks to you, Professor Daniel Malan, for sharing your invaluable insights on such an important topic. I especially liked how you brought in and touched on use of technology responsibly. I think that's very important in the fast-changing business world that we find ourselves today. I also want to say thank you to all the participants. We really appreciate your active participation, your positive feedback during the session. Your questions and engagement made this a highly interactive session, and I could see that it had impact on many of you that were on the session today. Also, just as we wrap up today's session, don't forget to join us for our next webinar, which is on the Era of Accelerated Change series. And this will be on how solid is your strategy really, on Wednesday, the 23rd of October. And this will be from 3 p.m. till 4 p.m. South African time. It's facilitated by Malfi Tot with insights from Nanda Pariachi and Clonela Ntoba. The session will explore how to evaluate and strengthen your business strategy in these fast-changing times. Okay, so make sure that you register. The details will be on our website. You can also find it in the chat and our social medias. Lastly, if anyone is interested in finding out more about our programs, please reach out to our team. You can also see a slide will show with regard to all the contact details of who you can contact to get additional information. But also we look forward to see you at our upcoming webinars and events. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And until next time, we'll see you again. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Go well. See you again soon.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Cheers.